focus on the value. Always put the value before the price.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the congruent relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and our guest today is Michael Tatonetti. And here are 3 things you want to know about Michael before we start. He is the founder of Pricing for Associations. He was a VP at Professional Pricing Society and left about a year ago. And surprisingly, if you've ever seen him, you'll be surprised too. He dances both ballet and tap. Welcome, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for having me.
Hey, it's good to be fun. How did you get into pricing?
Oh, I fell into it like everybody else. I actually got into it because of PPS. So my background before that, I've been in the nonprofit space for almost 20 years now. And I focus more on education and marketing. And then it's been about 7 years now, I think, since I had first started at PPS. But I worked there over education, and having been in that role, you have to, work with all of the subject matter experts. So, inadvertently, I learned pricing because I'm learning from all of the greats, and, overseeing all of the courses and, events and all that who were selecting for speakers. So I learned it because of that, earned my CPP, didn't plan on using it. But I always worked with associations on the side after about a year or two in on marketing. And then it just kind of grew from there. They all kept asking me about pricing, and I'm like, okay, well, let's go. Let me share what I know. And, it just kind of morphed into its own thing.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. So, let's spend some time today talking about pricing for associations, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Not necessarily your company, although I'm happy to hear about that as well.
Right.
But I really want to hear about the concept. And it was probably a couple months ago, I got to do a presentation on pricing for a group of associations.
Yep.
And it was pretty fascinating. But the thing that struck me is that an association is essentially the same thing as a subscription business.
It's similar. Yes. It's, I would say that it's very adjacent. I don't always look at membership as subscription, but it's very close. It's like a sibling to me. What's interesting or different to me about associations from, I would say more for profit is associations really, really care about the relationship and how you communicate. So the communication matters a lot when it comes to value and pricing. And they're also very sensitive to price. Like association members feel an ownership with the association. And so they question things a lot more than just, I remember each time Starbucks goes up by about 30 cents and I go to order and I'm like, okay, I don't care as much, but there's something about the association world where it's very mission driven, heart driven, relational. And that drives a lot of how you have to go about price increases, communicating value, as well as the models that exist and how you approach those models.
So that's actually really interesting because I belong to several different associations, mm-hmm. and I could see how some of them mm-hmm. I would be not upset, but I would be asking the questions, why would we raise price? What are we doing? Others, it's more of a, probably it's the larger associations. You're like, yeah, okay, just give it to me. I'll take it. Right. There's nothing I can do about it.
Yep. And that's what's interesting too, because within the association space, competition feels different because many times there will be a national or international organization. Then there will be chapter or local organizations, and you have to make that decision. Are you a part of both? And then they're almost competing against each other, but some of them in their bylaws are really a family of organizations, and then some are not. They're two completely different organizations that have no strategic tie-in for why they do what they do. So sometimes people are making decisions as well on, what am I a part of? Or even opposing organizations that might have slightly, different objectives or education that they offer at their events. So yeah, even that comes into play a bit of which ones do you care about? What are you looking to get? Typically, if it's more local, then you're looking for more networking and relationship. If it's more national, international, you want education, certification, things like that, lobbying the latest and greatest news at that big level. So how you interact with the association also does depend on their size, their function, all of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In my mind, I'm playing through the fact that I belong to National Speakers Association.
Mm-hmm.
I belong to the national group, and I belong to the Las Vegas chapter.
Yep.
And so how you play, my expectations of what I get out of those two different groups are very different, just as you said.
Exactly.
And I actually have the option of joining one or the other. I don't have to be a member of both. So.
Yeah, and sometimes you do have to be a member. It trickles up or down. You have to join the local, then you automatically join national, or vice versa. Sometimes again, it's not the case. And then even then, if it's not the case, are they affiliated by bylaws or are they two separate entities? And again, that's where, like during COVID, I saw a lot of national orgs moving in their own way. They gave a lot away for free because they could afford to. And then it really hurt the local and state associations, especially if they weren't affiliated, because then they're like, well, what do we do? They're giving away way better stuff than we have, and we can't meet in person and do networking the same way. So it's an interesting field and world to be in. And depending on who I'm working with, what are their pricing objectives and where are they at competitively in the landscape?
Yep. Okay. So I'm still going to push back and tell you that I think an association is the same thing as a subscription.
Okay.
So now I'm going to tell you why I think that.
Okay.
So when I think of a subscription, and what's fascinating about running a subscription business is that we actually have three different revenue buckets we have to manage. I call them win, keep, and grow. Most subscription companies would call them acquisition, retention, and expansion. I call that consultancies. I don't do that. Right. So win, keep, and grow. So in an association, I need to win new members. I need to keep my members. And then most associations, I don't think do a great job of this, but I'd really like to be able to grow not my membership, but grow the amount of revenue I get from any individual member. Right. And so I think that fits perfectly in an association. Feel free to tell me I'm right or wrong.
Yeah, no, with that description, I don't disagree, because even within the grow, that's where you have ancillary things like events, education, et cetera, et cetera. I think where it's different is typically when I think of a subscription. So I'm thinking of a few things that are a little bit different. One is most subscriptions, not all, of course, run on like a monthly basis. Of course, you can do annual, but most of them you think in monthly terms, where most associations are billing annually. Second, most subscriptions for profit are able to just auto bill, where some associations, depending on state, cannot auto bill. They can opt in, but for some they cannot. So that becomes a difference, because then there's an intentional decision of, do they continue? It's not just a sign up one time and it's on repeat. So it's not actually recurring revenue. And then the third area where I think it's a bit different is associations are typically divided into one of two categories, either organizational or individual. So they're typically called trade or individual. Trade is organization. Now, when you have an organization, then yes, typically they're not going to have it on renew, but they might say, yeah, we've got 500 people that are members of the org. We're paying it every year. Great. They cipher out who those members are. But when it's individual, typically it's still the organization paying, but then when they leave that organization, the credit card changes and they have to decide, do they want to pay individually or not? So because there's also that difference where I'm not signing up as an individual and putting it on my personal credit card. So even if I stay within the same industry, which many people change industries multiple times throughout their career, even if I'm staying within the same industry, I then have to go get employer approval to become a member of that organization still. And they might say, well, we've already got other people that are a member that are higher than you. They're the ones that go, or, sure, or whatever. So there is a little bit of a difference where when I think of subscription, like I'll use, Robbie Kelman Baxter, for example, here. She talks about the Forever Promise and that transaction. I think in that way, it's the same. But I think of traditional subscriptions as an individual, I sign up and then I cancel when I want. Where with associations, there's typically more thought power that goes into the decision to continue year over year. So that's where I think it's a little bit different in that buying cycle.
Yeah, I could buy that. Now, I want to point out, I'm going to be the president of my chapter for NSA next year.
Yep.
And last year we changed our billing from every year sending out an invoice and then begging someone to pay it to an auto pay. And so now they've signed up, and every year it's going to hit their credit card. And then we also offered the monthly option, which said, "Hey, go ahead and sign up per month, and we'll just hit you every month instead of once a year."
Yep.
And so far, it's worked out great for us.
I could see that, because I would assume, this is an assumption, but I would assume also that many members of that speaking organization are probably self-employed. So for them, it's also a lot easier to put it on your business credit card and just so in that case, yes, that goes back to what is your objective and who's your audience. So in some cases, I think you can do that and just go. And if so, amen, like go for it. Yep. I think if you can, great, but not always. It depends on the org and the audience. And so you have to kind of know those profiles of who they are.
Completely with you. And so I think the point I'd like to emphasize or make here is that we could think of associations as being relatively unique.
Yep.
But I think almost any characteristic you give me, I could say I could find that characteristic in business. So for example, back on my last real job that I had, I had a TripIt Pro account through my company. And then once I left the company, I had to decide, am I going to keep a TripIt Pro account or not? Right. And so it's like there's always similarities in different places as we think through that. And the only reason I point that out is because I love looking at different pricing situations, and I can always grab a lesson to learn from you to apply somewhere else.
Yep.
Love it.
Yeah. I don't disagree there. Yeah. I think in certain situations it is. I think it's just like any industry. In pricing in general, practitioners tend to think that they have unique challenges. In reality, when we all get together and share stories, it's pretty universal. But within that, there are, of course, certain, special things that we have to know for our niche. But I don't disagree. I would say the biggest thing I would advocate that's very different is the heartfeltness behind most associations and the members. They can get really passionate about price changes and value and all that jazz.
Yeah, they truly get identified. They truly identify with the organizations they belong to because they've attached their own identity to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. Okay, so tell me, how do I price an association?
Woo. So I'll get into some of the nuances that I think of where I lean in and where I don't care. One area when I'm first starting with anyone that I do care is their historical data. Now, most associations don't have robust data like if you were working with a large for-profit, right? They don't have the investment in those systems, and they have not collected or gathered that data in a great way. But I still like to look at the data, to look at consumer behavior and see how that's been historically. One area that I don't care about is competitors. When I go to an association, they tend to care. The way they typically price, if they're not working with a pricing person, is they look at competitors and then throw spaghetti at the wall based on that, which, many can do that anyway, but they especially do that. So I don't care too much about competitors. If I do, it's a SWOT analysis of perceived value. Even then I explain anyone can put on a marketing page what value they deliver. How good is it really? From there, what I really care about, what I typically focus on is market research with their database. So whether it's current members, lapsed members, people who are non-members, similarly, like if we're pricing an event, those who have attended in the last 3 years, those who, haven't attended, those who never, I like to talk to them a lot, especially around value more than price. I lean in on value a lot. I typically will not do work with an organization on just price. I typically require that we're doing value and price. because most organizations don't change their value too often, or if they do, it's the board. You'll understand this. The board is made up of members that are voted in. Though that board typically is who's responsible for hiring their CEO, and then the CEO hires the rest of the staff. The board, because they are a partial representation, typically the staff is who sets prices. Sometimes the board will for membership, depending on the bylaws, but typically they'll just go to the board and ask the board what they think, but it's not always a diverse board, meaning it's usually people who are seasoned, have been members for, 20 years, have volunteered. You don't really have newbies. You don't have great representation. So I like to talk with the members, the audience, find out, what value is missing. What do we need to add? What are other organizations doing well? What can we learn from them? That's where I kind of lean in on competitors and truth in that.
So give me, by the way, I love everything you've said so far.
Yeah.
Give us some examples of what does value mean to an association, or what kinds of questions you might be asking. Yeah.
So typically, some of the questions that I'm asking in general are, what are we doing well? What are we and what are we not doing as well? Is there anything that we can stop? But even with that, I look by segment, because that more tells me probably marketing communication to different segments. And then what other organizations are you a member of, and what can we learn from them? So that's where I kind of will gather more, and to me, better quality competitive intelligence. Associations are really good at listing like 10 or 15 bullets of what they do, even though no one accesses all of those. So one thing I'm really big on is, if we ask for a top, ranking, I'll just ask for top 2 or 3 and bottom 2 or 3, not the whole thing, because then it becomes irrelevant to me. People just kind of hit whatever after their top 2. So typically those types of questions in a survey, but then I'll follow that up with focus groups where I will do segments for each focus group, typically a few focus groups per segment. And I say, okay, we've heard you. This is what we're seeing. And then, talk to me about it. And we kind of work through that so I can have deeper understanding. So that's typically what it looks like for value. And then for price, I then talk to the org and say, okay, great. Maybe here's 5 recommendations for value adjustments. They'll say, okay, we could do this one in the next year, these 2 year 2, and then these other 2 in the next 5 years. Okay, so based on this, in the next year, next 3 years, where might price go? So of course, looking at their costs, even though I don't care about costs, that's just, the floor, make sure that we're, not losing money. But from there, I typically will rely on some mix, depending on the org and their sample size that we have, Van Westendorp, and then maybe conjoint analysis based on the Van Westendorp answers. But typically falling in line somewhere there to then figure out pricing and based on segment and based on value adjustments. And then be able to kind of deliver here's a few different ways that this can go, and figuring out what fits in with their strategy, what their board wants to do ultimately.
Nice. Yeah. Quick technical question.
Yeah.
How many samples do you like for Van Westendorp?
Ooh, okay. So, I mean, I like for anything I like. Well, I'll say this tongue in cheek. I like as much as I can get for anything, but of course, going through it all is another story. So I say that tongue in cheek. What I find is that for most associations, I probably only get about 3 to 5 or 8% of their audience answering. Of their database. Let me say that. So not members, because they might have 5,000 members, but have a database of 30,000, right? So typically, and it's usually majority member, very active people that are responding. So that's also hard to get sometimes young professionals or lapsed members, all that to respond. So typically I usually say if I can get about 5%, I'll take it. So that scales based on the size of the organization. Some things, we'll have hundreds of respondents and that's it because they're a local org. Others, we have thousands of respondents. So it depends on the organization.
All right. Good answer.
I wonder for you, let me ask you, what would you think as an incoming president of an org? I would be interested here because I think of more email open rates, click rates, right? Like, so that kind of falls in line. What would you want to see? And then what do you think you would see if you have an idea?
You will hate my answer, or maybe you'll love it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think what happens is once you get beyond 12, you pretty much get the same answer no matter what.
Yep.
And so you don't need 500 responses in Van Westendorp.
Yep.
Now, what's really cool is if you're going to do some segmentation work. So you say, I've got past members, current members, I've got young people, old people, I've got, so then if you get more and more people, you can start to see how the groups fit into Van Westendorp.
Yes.
But I think usually a dozen, if all you're looking for is the number.
Yep.
What I would challenge anyone to do who's using Van Westendorp is stop after 12 and do your analysis and see what number you get.
Yeah.
And then go do 50 or 100 or 500
Yep.
and see what number you get.
I might go back and look historically to see. That's interesting. But I don't fully disagree with you, because the other thing that I will say is I find that Van Westendorp kind of falls in line overall. Conjoint does, even focus groups. It gets after let's say I do 3 for a segment. After one, the second one might give me a little different, but like 10% different. And then the third, I'm like, yep, okay, I got it. So it's interesting that I don't need as much data as some people might think.
Yep. And the funny thing about Van Westendorp is it's not that accurate. It's okay.
No.
But the whole point is to get you in the ballpark.
A starting point, right? And then I go into, okay, if we're thinking we can go up about, $100, let's test a 50, then I'll segment conjoint out even and kind of test, okay, we got a 50, we got a 75, we got a $100. Where do we fall? Where's the sweet spot? And again, that's the art and science. I always tell people there's no right or wrong answer. It's just which one do we want to go with and explore.
Yeah. And so just for my own listeners, you just heard me say 12. I always recommend 50, but if you can only get 12, you'll probably get by. So that's
interesting. I'm going to remember that. I'm going to check that.
Okay. So the other thing I want to chat real quickly about is value communication.
Yeah.
So I love value. How is it that a association can better communicate the value they're delivering?
Yeah. And I was listening to your podcast this morning. I listened to a few episodes and I heard one where you were talking about how do you communicate value increase and your kind of quick formula. And, what I found with associations, what I do is I usually don't lean on cost increases as much. So I'll tell you that up front. What I do is because typically, everyone's getting the email,
Wait, can we pause for just a second? I just want to make sure we're on the same page, right?
Yeah.
So what you're talking about is what I always say when someone's going to raise their prices.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So go ahead.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So what I usually do is something along the lines of, we've heard you, we've ran, these surveys, focus groups, talked to you, and we're excited about these changes, and then kind of roadmap out here are the changes that are coming. And then with that, here is the price adjustment that's coming down the pipeline so that we can cover what we need for delivering this value. And I try to focus it on the organization's financial sustainability because they're a nonprofit. We can kind of pull, on that. So it's not about profitability. It's not going back in anyone's pockets. We need to make sure that we're at least covering what we're doing for you. So I kind of lean more with, we heard you, we've done this intense work, here's the output. And, we're excited to continue to serve you and give you what you need. So that's kind of the quick formula.
Yep.
Yeah.
So in a way, I've heard Netflix use a very similar one.
Yeah.
Right. As opposed to Netflix saying our costs went up.
Yep.
What they really say is we want to invest more in future content.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Which is essentially the same thing.
Yes. but because there's that sensitivity, it's not saying, hey, inflation. Because the other interesting thing, I did hear you say this on a prior episode. You had said something to the effect of if we just hook it onto cost, then are we going to go down? Like depending on what the cost is, right? And that's something I do tell people a lot is we're not going to go up and down because you're going to keep riding that wave at the higher price, right? The other thing is when you look at inflation overall, let's say it's 9% still, I haven't looked in, maybe 2 months now, but, you look by category, there's a huge variance. For things like education and that, it's like 3%. So the association space is not having a major increase. Maybe their technology is getting booted up on them. Otherwise, events are having higher costs. But outside of the events they put on, they're pretty lean and they can't really use that excuse to me I think members are smarter than that. So relying on the value, and we're doing this because you've asked for it, it does tend to hit a home run with that audience.
Good. Well, I'll assume that you know your audience better than I do, but I will say this.
Yeah.
When I get hit with a price increase and someone blames costs,
Yep.
I never go back and check to see did their costs really go up.
Yep.
I just take it as costs went up.
Yep. Yeah. The other thing that's interesting there is typically if I'm in a focus group, the members will talk about their costs going up. And that, so now we're supposed to pay more. And so again, they kind of personalize it a bit rather than looking at it as an optional thing. Like, okay, I'll buy the coffee a few days less. I'm thinking more B2C because really associations are mostly B2C. They kind of look at it like, no, I've been around. I want to continue to be a part of, like, make it fair. They're big on fairness and perception of fairness, I should say.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Michael, I think we could talk about this for a long time, but we're going to have to start wrapping it up. So I'm going to ask the final question.
Yep.
What's one piece of pricing advice you'd give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
I would say, I would honestly say focus on the value. Always put the value before the price. And that's why the word congruent for me mattered a lot in that opening statement, because there has to be harmony. I think if you just focus on price without value, no matter what industry you're in, you're going to lose. It's a race to the bottom. So focus on value, do what you say you're going to do. And then to me, you getting the price should not be an issue if it's all in alignment, if it's all congruent.
Fabulous answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Yeah, LinkedIn is easiest. I'm the only Michael Tatonetti on there. So I think it's LinkedIn /Dr. Tatonetti. But if they just search Michael Tatonetti, I'll pop right up.
Yep. And I'm sure the link will be in the show notes. And so to our listeners, thank you so much for your time. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? And if you have any questions or comments about the podcast or pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.